I'm Susan McBride, and I'm host for this morning. I wanted to introduce our debut of Phillip Bennett for a resident of Cathedral Village, who has a background in both psychology and religion, and he did a degree at Union Seminary for that study, and he is both a psychologist and a psychoanalyst. And by the way, he's also an Episcopal priest and has been in the Diocese of Pennsylvania in many of our parishes. So many of us know him as a wonderful priest as well.
And a musician.
And, oh yeah, I'm proud about the musician. Of course, we just heard his wonderful music. So he's a man of many talents. So I, for one, am very excited to hear about the Red Book, because I've learned a lot about Jung, but never seen the Red Book before. So thank you very much, Phillip.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. If you had to describe the history of the Red Book, it might actually be a mystery. It might go something like this. There was a very famous man who published many books, but there was one book that was never published. It was a book that his family owned and kept in a bank vault in Zurich for over 30 years. Jung himself was ambivalent about whether to publish this book, and he never did. So after many years of trying to get the Jung family to release this book for publication, in 2009, it was actually published in facsimile, and you'll see if you want to take a look when you leave today. This book, which we call the Red Book because he bound it in red leather, but he actually called it the Liber Novus, the new book. And it occurs at a time when he has had a painful break with Freud, and Jung called this his most difficult experiment, because what you will see is that he engages in fantasies, unconscious fantasies, and from those fantasies or waking dreams, he will draw extraordinary illustrations. When I first opened the facsimile, it hit me, the intensity of these drawings, the complexity. He does this between 1914 and 1930, really the beginning of the World War I, and you'll see in a video that he had premonitions about World War I and visions about the earth being covered with blood. So who was Carl Jung? He was Swiss. He became a psychiatrist. He had wanted to become an archaeologist, but didn't have the money to do the academic study. And I think when we look at his work, keep in mind archaeology, digging down, digging into the unconscious, digging into what he called the collective unconscious. He was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor. Wonderful name, don't you, Paul Achilles Jung? Who would give your kid that name? So, and his mother, Emil Preiswerk, who was a psychic, and if you look in her eyes, I think you can see something there. She apparently, her parents, both her mother and father, were involved in seances and all sorts of occult phenomenon. Her father was also a pastor, but this was a family interested in the psychic and the religious. His father died when he was at the age of 20. And we see here his birthplace in Switzerland, the first place he lived. We see him as a child, where in his autobiography, not quite an autobiography, but the things he told to Anelia Jaffe, which became Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. He says that as a kid, he felt he had two personalities. There was personality number one, which was more factual, scientific, and personality number two, which was given to imagination and fantasy. This is a signal moment in Jung's life. He was already well established at the Burgholzi, which was a psychiatric hospital in Zurich, where he worked with schizophrenics and was interested in how the images, visions that schizophrenics had often seem to correlate with other myths throughout world history. He had published a book on word association, and how that worked is he would give you, for example, a whole list of words, and then if you and told you what do you want to associate to this? So he might have, you know, the word fountain, and then you associate water. And he noticed that people will sometimes hesitate when given a particular word. And Jung's idea, so it's been contested, but his idea was that there was some sort of blockage there. There was a reason you hesitated, and that was significant. And he did many studies on this. And so he saw himself as a research psychologist, psychiatrist. That was one of his hats, but always this other interest in the paranormal, in the supernatural. Freud had read his work on association. Freud contacted him. Jung had already read Jung's work, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1900, which was his big breakout book that made him internationally famous. So the two men met together. Freud invited him to Vienna, and you can imagine the impact of looking at Freud's consulting room. Freud himself was fascinated with archaeology, with world culture. So you could imagine these two men meeting. And Jung says that they talked for 13 hours when they first met. I'm not sure how that's possible, but 13 hours. So there was some intense engagement between these two men. Freud was 20 years older, and Freud was in many ways not very well thought of. He was a neurologist, but became interested in the unconscious interpretation of dreams, as you know. Jung himself was already fairly established. But in the Freud-Jung letters, which were published, I remember reading them some time back and thought, my God, what an intense relationship this was. They talk a great deal about their relationship. So each of them is involved in what we would call depth psychology. And the premise of depth psychology is that the unconscious is real. There is more to our awareness than we are conscious of, and that this unconscious can be accessed through dreams, through slips of the tongue, free association, play, and creative process, and we'll see this more. So this is the sort of bedrock, as it were, or going down deeper than the bedrock. So here's an exchange between Freud and Jung. It's a very interesting exchange. Jung says, I confess this to you with a struggle. I have a boundless admiration for you, something of the character of a religious crush. I still feel it is disgusting and ridiculous because of its undeniable erotic undertone. This abominable feeling comes from the fact that as a boy, I was the victim of a sexual assault by a man I once worshipped. And a comment from Freud, you say you feel like I'm trying to control you and force my beliefs upon you. That is not my intention. I will pull back and withdraw my libido, hoping that you will in time be open to a greater intimacy. It's interesting the word he uses here, Freud, libido. We think of it in Freudian terms as the sexual drive. You have low libido, you take, Viagra. It's the sexual drive. Jung made a revision to say that libido meant psychic energy. It is whatever it is that gives us energy, putting it into projects, relationships. And it's interesting that here Freud uses it, perhaps in a sexual term, but definitely saying we are really into each other. There's intense energy here. But there was a break with Freud after 6 years of a very intense relationship. So this is what Jung says in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Freud, who had always made much of his irreligiosity, had now constructed a dogma. In place of a jealous God whom he had lost, he had substituted another compelling image, that of sexuality. He said to me, my dear Jung, promise me never to abandon the sexual theory. You must make it a bulwark against the black tides of occultism. And there are numerous instances where something uncanny would happen while Freud and Jung were together, and Freud would faint. He would pass out. We know now there is some comment that Freud made that if he had it all to do over again, he might study the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. Isn't that interesting? Because he came from an Orthodox Jewish family. And there's been some speculation that even Freud's approach to his study is rather Talmudic. But for Freud, he decided to go in a direction where he thought all religious impulse was infantile, right? It was seeking the great parent. And I would say there's a lot of religion that is infantile, but Jung, as we'll see, didn't dismiss it all out of hand as some defense. So this is a very, you may not be able to read it, but I'll read it for you, because this was Jung's big dream that caused him to make the ultimate split with Freud. And it sets up his idea of the idea that our unconscious is not only personal, but collective. So he says, I was in a house I did not know, which had 2 stories. It was my house. I found myself in the upper story where there was a kind of salon furnished with fine old pieces in Rococo style. On the walls hung a number of precious old paintings. I wondered that this should be my house and thought, not bad. But then it occurred to me that I did not know what the lower floor looked like. Descending the stairs, I reached the ground floor. There, everything was much older, and I realized that this part of the house must date from about the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval. The floors were made of red brick. Everywhere, it was rather dark. I went from one room to another, thinking, now I really must explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened that. Beyond it, I discovered a stone staircase that led down into the cellar. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room which looked exceedingly ancient. Examining the walls, I discovered layers of brick among the ordinary stone blocks and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew that the wall dated from Roman times. My interest by now was intense. I looked more closely at the floor. It was of stone slabs, and one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and again I saw a staircase of narrow stone steps leading down into the depths. These too I descended and entered a low cave cut into the rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke. Like something out of Indiana Jones. Freud and Jung would analyze each other's dreams. They'd spend a lot of time sharing each other's dreams and analyzing each other. And Freud's comment here was that he thought that Jung wanted to kill him. Interesting. And Freud said, no, it's not all about you. So Jung publishes his breakaway book, A Psychology of the Unconscious, later called Symbols of Transformation, in 1912. So we're really coming up on the time when he begins to work on the Red Book. So what does he say that's different from Freud? The psyche is inherently religious. In other words, it's seeking meaning, not simply driven by sex and biology. Jung did not dismiss the importance of sex, but felt that it was not the core of the psyche. Besides a personal unconscious, there is a collective unconscious, a deep inherited layer of the human psyche which is common to all people, containing universal patterns and themes called archetypes. And dreams do not disguise. Freud thought that when you dreamed about something, it was a disguise to keep you from facing your aggressive or sexual feelings or desires. Those needed to be unpacked to translate that it's really not a teapot, it's your mother or something. It was always standing for something else. And Freud said they are part of nature dreams. They express something as best it can, just like a plant grows or an animal seeks food. And there are some big dreams that contain numinous archetypal material. And you may have had some of those. I have. Those are powerful, the dreams that you recall all of your life. So the Red Book, as I said, was not published until 2009. This he speaks about in terms of his autobiographical material. He doesn't mention the book per se, but I think this gives you a feel for Jung's reticence. I have guarded this material all my life and never wanted it exposed to the world. I have suffered enough incomprehension and from the isolation one falls into when one says things that people do not understand. And here is actually at the very end of this book, when he had abandoned it for other projects, he writes at the very end, "To the superficial observer, it appears like madness." And this was great accusation against Jung that he was essentially psychotic. Now, he said he felt that he was going psychotic, but felt that he was still quite corpus mentis. And in fact, all of the things we see that he does now in these pages of the Red Book were done while he was actively practicing a successful psychiatric practice. He was raising, or at least his wife raised, 6 children. He was very busy and very functional. Where he got the time to do all of this, I have no idea. I've not been able to find that out yet, whether he didn't sleep at all or slept 2 hours or just was very fastidious and disciplined. So this is a video by Sadhu Samdasani. The Jung family gave him permission. He's an English scholar of East Indian origin. They gave him permission to see to the publication of the book, including translations of the very voluminous, complicated written sections, which are in calligraphy, which describe his elaborate encounters with these figures, his conversations. But this is, and I'll just say this as a preface, this was done at the Rubin Museum, which you might know is sadly no more. It was a museum of Eastern culture, particularly Tibetan Buddhism near Union Square. It folded because of lack of money. But in 2009, an exhibit was held for the Red Book, and you would go down to the lower level appropriately, and there you saw in a glass case, much like you would the Book of Kells, this manuscript open to, of course, only 2 pages at a time. It went to the Rubin and then to the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and then to the Library of Congress. So it really got a lot of press at its inauguration.
Welcome to the Rubin Museum. My name is Sadhu Samdasani. I'm a guest curator of this exhibition of Liber Novus, the Red Book of C.G. Jung. I'm
Can we do this louder?
Psychology, specializing in the work of Jung, based at the Wellcome Trust Center for History of Medicine at University College London. Liber Novus, Jung's Red Book, is what he considered the central work in his oeuvre. It is literally his most important work. It's startling that to this day it has remained unpublished and unseen by the public at large. His first major work in which he articulated his original theories was Transformations and Symbols of Libido in 1912. In this work, he subjected a large array of myths and religious conceptions in various cultures to psychological analysis. He argued fantasies of current individuals, fantasies and delusions of neurotics and psychotics, depicted the existence of a symbol-making function that was general to mankind. After finishing this work in 1912, Jung began to ask himself that if all cultures up to this date had had a myth, had lived within a functioning cosmology, what was his cosmology? In the autumn of 1913, he was on a train from Zurich to Schaffhausen, and on this journey he was overcome by a waking vision of worldwide catastrophe. He saw the surrounding landscapes being submerged under a river of blood with rubble and dead bodies floating, and he was completely transfixed by this vision. A few weeks later, he embarked on the same train journey, and the vision was repeated. This time he heard a voice saying, "Look clearly, all this will become real." Now, he initially wondered if that was simply a prospective indication of what was happening to him, i.e., does this indicate that he would simply lose his mind? To this end, he engaged in this act of self-investigation. The main means in which he did this was to provoke a series of waking fantasies within himself and enter into the landscapes depicted and enter into dialogue with the characters which emerged. He would do this in the evenings and weekends, meanwhile keeping up a successful analytic practice and professional career and his family obligations. He carried on provoking these fantasies and writing down the dialogues which ensued. He would later call this the process of active imagination, and indeed it would form one of the hallmarks of his psychotherapeutic technique, as he would encourage his patients to do likewise. So he then began to write a work in which he took the main fantasies, about 30 to 35 of them, and retranscribed them and subjected them to a lyrical elaboration and commentary in which he tried to divide from them general principles of psychological functioning and also some indication of what was good to take place within the world in a symbolic manner. This forms the first manuscript of what he would later call Liber Novus, or the Red Book. It consists of about 1,000 handwritten pages. After he wrote this text, he had it typed and sent it to some colleagues for their views and began to edit the text. After writing this and having it transcribed, he began to take out some parchment pages and he retranscribed the text again in this beautiful calligraphic style which you see in the exhibition here and illustrated with his paintings. At the same time, he began to encourage similar forms of self-investigation within his patients. Jung carried working on this text for 16 years, clearly intending initially to publish it, but unclear as to whether he should do so, fearful of his scientific and medical reputation. He carried on engaged in this activity until 1928, when he received a text of The Secret of the Golden Flower from the sinologist Richard Wilhelm, whom he met several years earlier. Jung was struck by the correspondence between some of the imagery in this old Taoist alchemical text that Phillip had sent him and his own imagery, such as the mandala of the Yellow Castle in which he was painting at the same time. So at this point, he resolved that instead of publishing his own material, instead of publishing Liber Novus or detailed studies of his cases, he would in fact engage in the comparative study of the process of individuation in other cultures, to try to define typical features which could be shown to have taken place in times far distant from his own. And this process was to engage him for the rest of his life. Jung continued to write texts written for the general scientific and medical public, in which he attempted to distill some of the main typical features which he could discover in his study of his fantasies, and to try to translate this into a general language which would be understandable by people today. It was through this act of translation, through working over the material, that Jung came up with many of his main theories that he's subsequently become famous for. Now, Jung clearly intended to publish this work, but left it to one side. But it forms the key to his whole oeuvre, for without studying this work, one is simply not in any position to understand how his work came about, its historical genesis. It provides the missing key, because one can then grasp what actually took place in Jung's process of individuation, how he began to generalize it, and how on the basis of his own experience he attempted to understand the myths, rituals of other cultures, and out of this form a general psychology.
So he mentions the word individuation, which for Jung was the process of becoming ourselves more and more fully, to integrate the various parts of ourselves. Jung has some interesting things about later life and aging, which I'd like to look at next week. In fact, he said a fair amount about that. I'd like to look at that and something called synchronicity, which is what we call sort of unusual coincidences that seem to have some sort of psychological significance. So that's just a little teaser for next week, but that's what the word individuation means. This is a classic kind of motif. This is the dark sea journey, and you see the monsters here. This is going into the unknown, right? And this is facing treacherous situations, passageways in life, which we all go through. He did these on vellum. He started with 2 pages of parchment, and he realized they were bleeding through, and so he used calf skin and gum arabic, which is a kind of a binder, and meticulously did these with various inks and paints. And those of you who are artists would know gouache, right? That it's a kind of wash, would you say? You can see how these patterns repeat. The squared circle of the mandala comes in various forms. You can see it everywhere, and you can see it in most cultures. Here we have an industrial scene below with the smokestack and the wind blowing, and this is a kind of commentary, as it were, about the state of the world, much like the World War II visions. And Phanes, who's the god of illumination, is the little creature that is right below the flaming cross. The egg appears very, very often. Egg, of course, is a very primary symbol of birth and creation, right? Many creation myths have a cosmic egg that breaks open. And here you see these wonderful little creatures down below, and how meticulous he was, and often painting these things cell by cell, almost like a kind of pointillism. This is Philemon, who was one of the spirit guides that he conversed with in the Red Book Fantasies, who is the wise old man. This is another character who is a kind of, as it were, friendly giant who Jung had all sorts of conversations with. You can see how elaborate these things are, how much time must have been taken in these. And just to give you a little detail close-up, you can see what he's doing here, and he has layers upon layers of dimensions in some of these things. They're really kind of, as we used to say in the 60s, trippy, right? And another great little creature. And here is the hero wrestling with the many-footed, dangerous monster. This reminds me kind of like of the 60s, 70s psychedelic artwork, doesn't it? Yeah. This is wild. So here you have this kind of cosmic explosion, and you have this huge serpent monster. Jung was big on this idea that symbols often had a kind of a two-natured quality, that what looked menacing could be life-giving, and that what looked life-giving could have its own shadow. This is a lovely one. His idea of individuation, that is each person has to become his or her unique self, but in doing that, we all are more deeply connected as we move through life into whatever you would call this, right? This is some sort of, whether this is the Big Bang, this is the cosmic source. And there's another detail. This is supposed to be kind of a window into heaven, as it were. When he did his artwork, he learned how to use the binding equipment and the paint to help it to affix successfully. On occasion, he was not able to do that, and he realized he needed to use varnish on some of his works of art to keep them from cracking. But this is one we see where, in fact, there was some cracking. Another one. You see how their faces all around you up here. If you keep looking, you'll see more eyes and faces and creatures. So we mentioned the word archetype, and this is kind of a cheesy chart. I was looking for something that would be easy to use visually. And just by way of introduction, it's not like you have this number of archetypes, right? They're just this or that. Rather, in fact, Jung thought that these are inherited behavioral traits that occur across cultures, often expressed in myths, movies, dreams, sleeping or waking in the case of some of Jung's visions. So we all know these, don't we? There's the nurturer, the magician, the lover, the jester, the innocent, the explorer. There's the outlaw, there's the creator, the sage, the ruler, the hero, and the regular guy. I mean, movies are full of this kind of stuff, aren't they? And literature. So we see these themes over and over. And the hero, of course, is probably one of the powerful themes in mythology. Here's Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, right? This classic kind of hero confrontation with the forces of evil, the evil father. And the feminine variant, which is getting more play now in the movies. And it's an ancient dimension, right? The fierce feminine, the protector, the woman warrior, Athena. And so I have to warn you, I have to brace yourself, but we're talking about the power of archetypes and how pervasive they are. This is not meant as a joke. This is not a cartoon. You can buy this on the internet. But take a look at it. How absolutely powerful and resolute he is. He's standing, I don't know if that's Manhattan or everything he owns in DC, and he's going to tear down a lot of that and build ballrooms. Look at him standing as if the rock itself is giving way to the weight of his authority, and the codpiece, right? The resolute chest. So I think when we think about the horrible state we're in today, we have to think, okay, there's something very powerful being manifest. The hero that protects us, the hero that drives out the alien, the hero that will lead us back to the good old days, right? And when people are in a state of uncertainty, the world is very complex and very global. There's something about this it's very, it draws with intensity. And of course, we know it's happening all over the world in many different governments. So that's enough of that. But just whenever you think, well, how could people listen to him? How could he get away with what he's doing? Well, think about this. And maybe without it being too grandiose, we need other politicians who have that kind of presence and charisma, because we are not just intellectual beings, we're emotional beings, and we live by stories, and the hero is essential. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of a personal story here. When Jung did his own fantasy work and he called up these images that he dialogued with, he drew, he wrote down long conversations, he was doing what we said was active imagination. And in my own Jungian analysis, it was not uncommon if you had a figure in a dream, when you woke up, you would record the dream, and then you might have a conversation, with the old man. Who are you? What do you have to say to me? Now, you could say, well, you just make it up, right? Why, you're just making this up? And Jung would say, exactly, that's the whole point, that you're making it up. Why are you telling this story? what does this figure have to say to you? And it was said of Jung that he would never let any of these figures go until they had told him something. So think the night journey, think, again, dealing with the monsters that we face, and think about my father, his father, and myself. Walter Bennett, who was really the runt of the litter of a very successful family in southern Indiana. They were gentlemen farmers. I didn't know much of this story until genealogy, unearthed it, as it were. My father, who, if you went to my concert, he started in Arkansas. His family wandered restlessly, and they ended up in California. Just a lot of underachievement on his father's part. My father, very gifted, but a lot of underachieving, and a lot of depression. And myself still looking pretty chirpy there, with my, that was red, by the way, red hair, many, many years ago. So I decided during my talk therapy that there was stuff I was not getting to. And I saw a woman at a conference who did something called authentic movement. Now, early on in Jungian circles, people said, let's try to get to some of this unconscious material, not only by talking, but by using art, by using dance. And Jung was surrounded by many artists, dancers. A woman, Mary Stackhouse, started something, as I said, authentic movement. She was a student of Martha Graham's. I saw this woman working, and I thought, why don't I just see what will happen if I do something besides just the talk therapy? So I went up to New Haven, Connecticut to see her, and this was her office. It was an old Victorian ballroom in one of those magnificent New Haven mansions. And the idea of authentic movement is that you are invited by the therapist, who is called a witness, to simply move spontaneously and to choose music if you would like to do that. Well, of course, I was immediately just frozen. The idea I was going to move spontaneously. But she had a bunch of cassettes, which is what we had then, and I picked Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. What possessed me? What possessed me? If you know the music, it's ominous how it starts, and it begins to build and build and build. And so I began to let myself go and just move with the music, and pretty soon I kind of forgot she was there. And what happened is I found myself on the ground in a kind of fetal position, beginning to grow up, that I could feel myself now growing up and reaching a kind of a toddler stage where I skipped around the room, probably a little earlier age than these kids, but that kind of spontaneity that children have. And I remember skipping around this huge ballroom, and all of a sudden I became aware of this horrible, scaly creature at the perimeter of the room, which was slowly stalking me, just taking its time as I moved more and more frantically. And of course, by this time, I'm in this world. It's very real. The creature finally comes up to me, is able to pull me down to the ground, and we wrestle back and forth. And I'm quite clear that I'm wrestling for my life. I'm fighting for my life. And I went down a couple more times. I got back up on my feet. And I finally just had this moment's realization, you're never going to get away from this thing. So you have to find some way to engage it without getting killed. And so I began to pull it towards me, just ever so slightly, and could feel the scales, this scaly creature, but realized inside of it there was this very, very frightened creature. And we ended up kind of moving around the ballroom together and dancing together. Now later, after I went back to the talk therapy, we realized this had a great deal to do with this family legacy of darkness, and that it was pulling me down, and I was afraid I was down for the count. Interestingly, what really opened up from this, that was just a huge breakthrough, is that I had a dream in which an adult son and his father were in a suburban house, a ranch-style house, and it was an real estate open house. The house was to be sold. The house was in bad repair with algae over the windows. Everything was needed a paint job. People were coming in at the open house to look at the house. And in a back room, a den, the son and the adult son and father were in the room, and the father was screaming at the son, just berating him, not hitting him, but verbally assaulting him. And the son just stood there passively, taking it. And my analyst said, after I finished recounting the dream, she said, what would happen if the son didn't take it anymore? And I said, he'd kill himself. The father would kill himself, which sent me back to a conversation with my father. And in fact, about the time that I was that little kid skipping, he began to go through profound suicidal times. Not an attempt that I know of, but this heavy, dark depression that settled. And of course, kids pick this stuff up, don't they? It's in the air, it's in the household. So I give that to you as a personal example of how sometimes engaging this stuff really moves beyond the intellectual and can really bring us into this place of deep imagination. So I wanted to just allow some time now. This is very stimulating material to give us some time to talk, to ask questions. Are there things that have come up for you? Yeah, I just think we'll go ahead and go with that.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Here you go. Charlie, you want to hand the cards? Thank you. Thank you.
In his writings, did Jung talk about the drawings? Was there a direct connection?
In the writings?
In the book.
In the book itself.
The illustrations and the text. How did they relate?
That's a very good question, Daryl, because I've had a heck of a time unpacking each of these drawings and finding out just what it refers to. In some cases, it's pretty clear that in the text and the dialogue, you see so-and-so is being illustrated. There may be a more direct correlation. I have yet to find it. I've got books on Jung's art. Some of these, I've been able to identify. Some of the drawings that are not figurative are probably more his constant interest in archetypal symbols, mandalas, but I'm still working on that. The text also, by the way, can be very tedious. He has long passages about the death of God. He read Nietzsche, and he was, as a pastor's son, he's wrestling with what God do I have, what is my mythology? So there are long discourses of conversation, so it's pretty dense stuff, yeah. Yeah, Johnny?
I did just want to mention about the Rubin Museum. It still has a presence. It's not in a fixed location, though.
That's right.
And I think that that's really wonderful that it moves around the country with its collection and disperses all those teachings around the country. And it can be accessed online. And
Nice.
so it's very instructive. I think you might really enjoy that.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Johnny had mentioned Tibetan Buddhism, whether that was in some ways influencing Jung's archetypes, and I could say everything influenced Jung. He read everything. Reading him can be very challenging because he just kind of goes off like water on flat land sometimes, and then he'll come back after 7 or 8 footnotes, and then you can kind of resume the narrative. Yeah.
This gives me a much more depthful understanding of dreams. I don't know when, but I was once told that the main purpose of dreams is to keep you asleep.
You lost yourself.
I had quite a few dreams, and I was looking for a bathroom, and that usually meant I had to go to the bathroom.
Right. Well, Joel, that's an interesting question because dreams, there are many ways to look at them, right? And are they all profound? Obviously not, right? You know, there are many different takes on dreams. I do know that when I was working with a Jungian analyst, I had much more interesting dreams than I do now, right? Because you needed to bring something in, right? Something, yeah.
What extent to what extent did William James influence
It's not
Jung?
gonna pick up.
Use your mic.
Turn it on.
Quite a bit.
Question
No.
You have to repeat the question.
To what extent did William James?
He was definitely an influence. Definitely he was. You know, and I heard you say William Blake. It's interesting you said William James.
James separates, instructs us to separate the me from the I.
Right.
So you mentioned that.
Right, which was definitely a theme in Jung, the capital L as self, right,
Yes.
versus the individual self only. Yeah, yeah.
This was really a huge disclosure for me to see Jung as a practicing artist.
Mhm.
I had no idea.
Right,
And this isn't casual.
No.
This man knows what he's doing.
that's right.
Do you know where and how in his life he developed these skills?
Well, I'm just starting this book on Jung in art, and apparently he did artwork. I'll have to bring it next week. He did very conventional artwork when he was a young man. Is that something interesting, though, about Jung? He was very rigid about saying that this was not art. He felt these were products of the psyche, and he was not an artist. And he got very rigid about this. And for example, he was very opposed to abstract modern art. He had very definite ideas in his mind as to what this stuff was. But it is art, is it not? I mean, it's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. And then he did this. There, you know, in his collected works, I think there are a couple mandalas that Jung drew, and they were in black and white. So people knew he drew things. And this book was it was in his consulting room, so his patients could see it. It wasn't that it was completely hidden. He would say, Rick's kind of doing a little turning of pages. It's fun to turn it. So he didn't hide it, and he said, you know, you might want to do something like this yourself. Well, I could never do something like this. But the family felt very strongly that this was so provocative and evocative that they decided, let's just, you know, keep this one for the ages. Yeah.
Well, aren't they excessively symmetrical?
Well, that's a good point, right? You don't find anything that
Freud
really
would make
is
something of that.
right. But there are some that are asymmetrical in some ways, but they're still very carefully, meticulously worked out. This is not Pollock, right?
Yeah, there are all those with the little hungry caterpillar on them.
Right, right. Yeah.
A couple comments. One is Jung's reticence to share some of his material, lest people would think he was absolutely crazy, is certainly belied by the art. You know, whatever you might say about the artwork, it is clearly not the work of a schizophrenic.
Right.
It would be impossible for somebody who was really psychotic to produce that kind of material. And the other comment, with his break with Freud, in an oversimplified way, Jung replaced the idea of sexuality with religiosity. But why not? Because his father was a pastor.
Right,
I mean, that's where he came from. So,
right. Could you say a bit more, Jim, about why a psychotic or schizophrenic could not draw drawings like this?
I don't know. I spent most of my life with schizophrenics. And just, the fact, the magnificent organization of it.
Okay,
And the completeness of it, you know, I'm certainly not much of an artist or an art critic, but each one of those illustrations is so beautifully and completely done.
uh-huh. You think that they would be, that level of organization,
I don't
or
think it would have been
focus,
possible.
that's interesting, yeah.
It's too disorganized.
We have somebody who, okay, someone.
Just go out on the other side.
Well, it's fun to talk about the art and his very precise feeling that it must be organized a certain way.
Yes.
And that shows up the entire opposite of an abstract artist
Yes,
who wants you to go with the flow wherever you want to go.
that's right.
And I just think that's a fascinating feeling between his organizational feeling and don't you go where there is
That's
art.
right.
Here's where we are. So I just thought that was great fun to see.
Yes, that's true. And, you know, like most people who develop theories in schools, he was rather narcissistic, charismatic, narcissistic. He had very strong opinions. And like Freud, he had a devoted ring of disciples in the first generation, and who then began to break off in various factions. But no, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? It's kind of heady. And he says he ended up developing a kind of typology system. Thinking and feeling were two of the polarities, and he says in an interview that he's not good at feeling. You know, there's something heady about this.
Right here.
It's also medieval manuscripts, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was a kind of medievalist. You see in that dream, he's going down different layers of history and time. Yeah, yeah.
So I knew a little bit about Freud and Jung, but this was very revealing to me, things that I certainly didn't know at all. There are a lot of people in here who are psychiatrists or therapists. I'm wondering, how would somebody like that here diagnose him, Jung, in the modern parlance?
That's an interesting question.
Genius.
Genius. Stable genius? Not always stable.
Kind of a busybody.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting question, and people have different parameters in terms of what they think is normal. And I first read Jung in an English class in college, because, you know, he was not that well thought of in the psychiatric community, and you could see why. That even without looking at his drawings, he had a penchant for mythology, imagery, religion, and so somebody might see him as crazy or avoidant, you know? Depends on the lenses you use, right? There was I don't know if anybody has heard about Donald Winnicott, who was an English pediatrician who was also a child psychoanalyst. Wonderful, creative guy, helped children to try to develop their own authentic self or keep it from being impinged completely, like you saw in my experience as a child. He was absolutely convinced that Jung had a psychotic core. He was absolutely convinced of that and would be not dissuaded any other way. So. But psychoanalysts could do that to each other. They diagnose each other and retaliate with a counter-diagnosis. Oh, yeah?
It's very interesting to see how that his approach was really more artistic than scientific. You know, I guess it was both.
That's a big dimension in Jung, always thinking himself as a scientist, and in this case, a scientist of his unconscious and what came out of it. But you see in Jung this whole business of personality one as a child, personality two. Personality one is the schoolboy who's living in the ordinary world of Switzerland, and personality two is the little boy who's whittling a piece of wood and making little mannequin heads on them, and then finding pictures of these in primitive cultures and being fascinated with what's underneath, what's the connection. So, right, scientist and I would call Jung an intuitive mystic. I think that the more I read, the more I realize that he really was a mystic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. This is a kind of, well, anyway. Could you say anything about the importance of Jungian thought at Union Theological Seminary?
That's a good, yeah, right.
Because it was my impression that it was very pervasive.
Right. When I went there, it was called the Program of Psychiatry and Religion. They had a psychiatrist on the staff. And Anne Ulanov, who was for many years, almost 50, the chair of that department, had been a close student of Paul Tillich, German theologian, whose big thing was depth, existential experiences of depth. That's what we live by, not just abstract ideas. More recently, some might know Pamela Cooper White, who was the pastoral care professor at Lutheran Seminary, now called, is it Union Seminary, on Germantown Avenue. She was the chair, but it has a long tradition, and not just Jungian. I mean, all sorts of psychoanalytic stuff and culture. One of the things, just a quick plug here, when we think about psychoanalysis, we tend to think about the American variant that started after World War II. Ironic, because Freud didn't like physicians because they thought he was a crackpot. In America, you had to become a physician in order to become a psychoanalyst. And often it was a very rigid worldview, at least officially, right? All the jokes we see about the abstinent analyst who never says anything, you have Portnoy's complaint, or all these wonderful things, right? What did he say? He said he heard his analyst, he thought he had bells, but maybe it was just countertransference, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of, New Yorker cartoons are full of that, right? Anyway, I digress, but I think one of the things I particularly liked about Anne's approach is she was adamant that religion could be defensive and needed to be explored, but psychology could be defensive and needed. She used an image from Paul Ricoeur. It's like a Brillo pad. You have to scrub them. Each has something to say to the other, about their strengths and weaknesses. Yeah. Yeah.
On that same theme, I wonder if you, unless you're going to talk about it next week, but say more about Jung's ambivalence or complexity regarding institutional religion and traditional religion. Right.
That's actually, that might be something to touch on some more. Yeah, definitely ambivalent about it. It's interesting. I think next week we can look at that a bit more too, where he says he believes in God, and he knows God. He doesn't believe in God. He knows God, and he knows what he calls the God image and the psyche. There's been tons of stuff written and discussed about, did Jung believe in God per se? He had a tremendous impact on religious people and pastors, as did Freud, actually. There were a lot of clergy that trained as analysts or became informed psychologically in their thinking. And Jungian work certainly spread. Tons of people, Episcopal priests. Somebody was telling me there's a Quaker conference of Jungian thought. Pendle Hill has them. Yeah. So he had a tremendous influence in religious circles. But ambivalent towards the church, absolutely. Absolutely. And felt that his father didn't have enough of a soul connection. That his father had an intellectual commitment, but Jung felt he just wasn't somehow connected. That was Jung's experience. Yeah.
During my seminary life years ago, I took a clinical training program in the summer, 60 days of clinical training, and the dominant name almost every day was Jung.
Yeah.
We had lectures, we had discussions. It just seemed like if Jung weren't around, our clinical training might be bereft.
Well, you had that's interesting, your training had that, but not all seminary training had that at all. Sometimes it had a much stronger Freudian emphasis, and Jung was definitely persona non grata. So that's interesting, wherever you ended up. May I ask where you studied?
At Ann of Newton.
Yeah.
And the head of the program was a big Jungian advocate.
Absolutely, right.
What was his response?
Where did he
Where
study?
did he go? Study?
Andover, Newton.
Andover, Newton.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Philip, I think we've hit the noon hour, and we're fortunate that you can come back next week and continue with what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you want, just if you want to flip a few pages before you leave, the little red book is actually all of the text that was deciphered, as it were, and put into a reading edition.